Welcome back to F1 Break Check. The summer break is over and the circus is back in action. And today we'll be talking about the Dutch Grand Prix. We'll talk about the history of the Grand Prix at Zandvoort as it celebrates 75 years. We'll talk pit strategy in our tech corner, and we'll discuss the latest news, rumors, and reactions to all of the action from this last weekend. Coming up on F1 Break Check.
Welcome. You are listening to F1 Break Check, the epic podcast for all things Formula One, where we discuss technology, history, news, and perspective. With your hosts, Scott Vick and Corey Breen.
All right, welcome back to F1 Break Check. The summer break is over. Corey, my intrepid co-host, is here with me. Corey, how you doing today?
Oh, good. The wait is finally over, and
yes,
it did not disappoint.
No, it did not. Did you enjoy your summer break, or were you like me, like an adult crack addict?
Yeah, trying to find any memes at all possible, any of the latest rumors, all that stuff, ear to the ground, so to speak.
Yeah,
as much as possible.
As we talked about. Yeah, but as we talked about during our summer break episode, it was like this year has been kind of weird in the fact that there was very, very little news that came out, as far as, the silly season or anything else this year in the summer break, which was really, really unusual.
It's very weird that there was absolutely nothing, I mean, a little bit here and there, but nothing like what you would expect in all the past seasons, nothing even close to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's really kind of a very strange year. I don't know if it's the teams have gotten better at keeping secrets or which is, so it seems like in this day and age of social media, stuff that they could have kept under wraps in the past, somebody's always leaking because somebody's always listening and somebody's always around, it seems like. So let's talk about the history of the Dutch Grand Prix. As I said at the top of the show, this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Zandvoort track, located in Zandvoort in the Netherlands, located on the, practically on the beach, right on the coast. It's just an absolutely just beautiful area of the Netherlands, which that's saying something, being the Netherlands, which is just, It seems like it's all beautiful. So track first opened up in 1948 and it hosted its first Grand Prix in 1951, but paid no points. The track was actually built from, a lot of people don't know this, but the original track was actually built reutilizing roads that were built during the German occupation. The road, the main straight was actually, for the original track, was actually part of a communications road that was used by the Germans to also do victory parades up and down this road. And then after the Netherlands was freed from the German occupation, they reused these roads to build the original track.
Wow.
So
isn't that crazy?
It is. It's just absolutely crazy. First couple years, the track was used to host Grand Prix, but they weren't part of the actual official F1 calendar. And then in 1952, for the first time, it was actually part of the official F1 schedule, but it didn't pay any points. They had another break in 54, and then 1955 saw the first year that it was run as a full part of the World Drivers' Championship. So then they had another break in 56 and 57, and then the Dutch Grand Prix became a fixture on the calendar from 1958 until 1985, with the exception of 1972 being the 1 year break. From 1985 to 2021, it was off the calendar. And then with the popularity of Max Verstappen and the sudden renewed interest in F1 by the Dutch fans, the way that F1 has grown in the United States, and we've gone from just a few years ago of having 0 Grand Prix in the United States to now this year we're going to have 3 of them. Well, now the same thing happened with, just because there's been such a huge increase in the interest in Formula One in the Netherlands that it became a no-brainer to put it back on the calendar. The original circuit was 4.2 kilometers long. The front straightaway used to be significantly longer than it is now, running through forest there in Zandvoort. It was almost twice as long just on the front straightaway. And if you look at a map of the original track, it has a very wide open layout, very reminiscent of the Nordschleife at the Nürburgring. But then after 1985, because of noise concerns and environmental impact and things like that, part of the original circuit was sold off to a private company that was doing like park development. The track was basically reprofiled into the track that we are used to today, where it's very compact, very twisty and tight, great elevation changes, got some absolutely fantastic corners. But the really ironic thing is that when it went from its original 4.2 in 1989, when the track was shortened significantly, it was reduced down to about 2.5 kilometers or about 1.5 miles long, really, really short. But as time went on, until we got back to the point where the track is now in its much more compact layout, which Zandvoort is one of those tracks that it's like some of the grandstands you can actually see almost at least half, if not more, of the track because of the way that the elevation changes and everything are done. Wow. Is you can actually see them come around one side. You'll lose them down around one set of corners on the infield. On the back side of the track towards the final corner into the straightaway, you can all see all of that from one set of grandstands. But the really ironic thing is that when it went from its really wide open layout, it was 4.2 kilometers, roughly 2.6 miles. And in its current iteration, where it's all compacted into a much smaller area, it's back to 4.2 kilometers. Zandvoort is unique for a couple of reasons. One, like I said before, it's located right on the coast. The track is literally like within walking distance of the beach, but being on the coast, it lends itself to being very susceptible to really strange changes in the weather like we saw this weekend. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. But one of the other things that's really unique about Zandvoort is the fact that other than the transports that the teams use to move the cars, pavilions, and things like that around, there is no parking at the track. So when the fans come to the track, they actually have to park at a car park. I heard somebody say on the Sky Sports telecast that the closest car park is like a mile away, and almost everybody either walks or bikes to the track, and that they actually have a green space outside of the track where everybody parks their bikes. And on a race weekend, you will literally see thousands and thousands of bicycles parked in this green area. And according to what they've said is that almost none of them are locked up because everybody trusts everybody else and stuff. And so they don't even lock up their bikes when they get there. They just park their bikes. They go into the track. They have their fun. They enjoy the racing. And then they come back out, jump on their bike and either head back to the car or head back to the hotel or whatever. It's really unique, a really unique race in that respect. And the fact that, it's like you don't see these massive car parks like you do at other tracks like Silverstone and Monza and things like that. So really cool vibe. One of the most notable races at Zandvoort was on the old track. Its original layout was the last year that it was run before the long break. So in 1985, it saw Niki Lauda take his 25th and last Grand Prix victory there as the last race. It was very fitting that it was his last Grand Prix win at the last Grand Prix held before 2021. A couple notable winners is Jim Clark has the distinction of having won the race 5 times, and Jackie Stewart has won it 3 times. And then now Max Verstappen has equaled that and won the race 3 times as well. And it also makes the distinction that since it came back in 2021, Max Verstappen has won all 3 races as his home Grand Prix. We're going to move on to our tech corner. This week, we're going to be talking about pit strategy, the evolution of the pit strategy. And we're going to do kind of a deep dive into the current strategies and the way that F1 and the teams manage the strategy for doing pit stops. In the early days of Formula One, there was not a lot of strategy that was involved when it came to pit stops, because although there weren't anywhere near the rules around pit stops like there are now, back in the early days of Formula One, pit stops actually took minutes, unlike what we're used to now, where they take seconds and everything. I mean, literally, 2 to 3 seconds. A long pit stop is considered 4 seconds. And back then, in the very early days of Formula One, they had what were called knockoffs. I'm sure you've seen the pictures of them, or you've seen classic cars now that instead of having 4, 5, or 6 lug nuts like your average road card has, it would have a single nut that would go onto the hub. Now, in modern days, you see them using the impact guns to take off the single nut that holds the wheel on. Well, back then they didn't have anything like that. So they literally would take and use hammers to take and beat on the knockoffs. That's why they were called knockoffs, is because they literally had to be knocked off, because when they tightened them up, they would hit them with a hammer several times to torque them down so that they wouldn't come loose during the race. It was very rare for them to change tires during a race, simply because it did take so long for them to perform a pit stop, that pit stops were actually generally rare. It was only when a tire was deflating or for some reason the tire had a problem that a driver would bring the car into the pits. Under those conditions, because of the long pit stops, that's the reason why. And also because nowadays, when you see a modern day Formula One pit stop, there is roughly 16 to 18 mechanics operating during the pit stop. Well, back then, the teams were much, much smaller, and you generally never had more than 2 or 3 mechanics working on a car during a pit stop.
Well, not only that, but you didn't have near the electronics, the alerts that you have today. You didn't really have the communication like you have today. So it was completely different, right?
Yeah, it was, because, I mean, you're right. You hit it right there, right on the head, in the fact that they didn't have radios. All of communications between the mechanics and the drivers were all done by boards that they would hang over, that they would either, write on, and later on would, use movable, removable letters and numbers to literally stick it out over the pit wall, which they still use as a backup to this day in case the radio does go out, which has happened before. More often than not, back then, that was how they communicated, was they would stick these boards over the pit wall as the driver would fly by, and it was his responsibility to look at that board. So if they wanted him into the pits on the next lap, they would literally write pit on the board, stick it over the wall, driver would see it, and then on the next lap around, he'd pull into the pits. And then
sometimes, but you still can see those boards today, though, right?
Yes. Yeah, you can still. Now, they're not as prevalent because they're not needed as much anymore with the radios. The radios have become much more reliable, but the teams have been known to still utilize them as a backup or as a secondary. When they don't want to say something over the radio, but they want to give a particular piece of information to the driver, they'll put it on the board and then stick it out over the wall, so that way it can use whatever code that they want or whatever. Most of the time, it's usually just an interval to the driver in front of them and what place they're in. But also sometimes it can take and be to signal, it's time for a pit stop or something like that. Also, because of the lack of communications and everything with the car, sometimes the driver would have a problem, would pull into the pits, and the mechanics wouldn't even be ready for them. They wouldn't even be expecting them, but then it would jump into action to work on the car.
How long ago would you say that was? Was that like 10 years ago? No, more like 20 or 30 years ago, right?
Oh, that's more like 50 or 60 years ago. I mean, this was very, very early days. Now, in the 60s, the pit stop started to evolve just like everything else in the sport, where a lot of the teams were still using the knockoffs. But when the cars went from the original front engine, rear drive type chassis, and they became the mid-engine rear wheel drive cars, they were still using the knockoffs though on the wheels. Even in those days, Lotus and some of the other teams realized, well, wait, instead of having one mechanic have to try to run around and do every single tire, let's have one mechanic for each wheel. And so they would be out there with their hammers, and they would still be responsible for a particular wheel. In the 60s is when you started to see the evolution of the number of mechanics start to grow during a pit stop. And then also because, as we talked about in a previous podcast, with the evolution of the tires, it went from oftentimes the drivers would use the same set of tires for the entire race distance. Now tires became much softer and had a tendency to wear out much faster. And so it became much more important for mechanics to be able to take and change out the tires during the race. And then also because of the cars becoming so much smaller when they became mid-engine, they carried much smaller fuel tanks. And so the fueling also became important. So fast forward into the 70s, we saw the evolution of the pneumatic air guns came into vogue to be used by the teams, where they took, instead of having the knockoff on each wheel, they would have a locking nut that went over the hub. Usually that would have a cotter pin, and they would put through the wheel nut to keep it locked into place so that it couldn't come off. But then when the driver would pull into the pits, they would remove the pin, use the pneumatic gun to pull off the nut, and then put the new wheel on, put the nut back on. Even with that, the guns have evolved so much from very simple pneumatic, very low torque, hence the need for the locking mechanisms. With each iteration, the splines, or the little pieces that's, when you're looking at the nut, it will have like little grooves that are sticking out all the way around the circumference of it. And they're commonly referred to as splines. And those splines will, over the evolution of the tire change, the teams learned that the more splines you had, the easier it was to get the gun into the right position on the nut. And it also greatly reduced the chances of, by not being exactly on the nut right and then hitting it with that high torque pneumatic wrench, it would literally shear off the splines. So over time, they started putting more and more splines on there because it made it easier. But I mean, we saw it just happen, 2 or 3 seasons ago when Valtteri Bottas was with Mercedes. He was leading the race and actually ended up losing the race because when he pulled into the pits, they sheared off the nut and couldn't get the tire off. And of course, with the tire rules being what they were, they ended up having to retire the car because they couldn't just put on 3 new tires and send him out with a 4th tire, because the way that the rules are written around tire changes now, if you change tires, all 4 tires have to be changed. And also because of the requirement to use multiple compounds, they couldn't send him out with 3 tires of one compound and a 4th tire of a different compound. So at that point, they had no choice but to retire him. That's kind of the evolution of the tire change. And then also you've had the evolution of the fuel stop as well. So during the 60s, like I said, when the fuel tanks became much smaller, as the cars became much smaller and much lighter and everything, fueling was allowed. But I believe it was 78 or 79. Refueling was outlawed over safety concerns after several pit fires, and also because there were teams that had figured out a way to use refueling as a way of cheating to get around the minimum weight requirement of the cars. Tyrrell was the most famous for this, and it's a very, I don't know if you know this story or not, Corey, but Tyrrell in the mid 70s would actually always do a late pit stop during the races. And what they were doing is, as they were filling the engine, as they were fueling the car, the fueling rig would have ball bearings flowing into the tank. So this way they could race at a much lower weight, but then towards the end of the race, they would refuel. They would put these ball bearings into the fuel tank that would increase the weight of the car, so that way they could get around the minimum weight rule.
That's crazy.
But what was even crazier is that occasionally a ball bearing would actually work its way through the fuel system and would actually be shooting out of the trumpets.
I was wondering how they got around that.
Well, most of the time that what they would do is they would use mesh screens and stuff over the fuel lines inside of the fuel tank and stuff to keep the ball bearings from getting sucked up into the fuel line. But occasionally that would fail, or it would get past it. And the next thing you know, it's shooting BBs out, shooting ball bearings out of the engine. So refueling was banned. And then I believe it was I want to say it was either 93 or 94, refueling was brought back to the sport. For one, they wanted to increase the entertainment value. And 2, Formula One wanted to put more of an emphasis on the need for pit stops. Because oftentimes the teams would only, even though they were using super, super soft tires during the races and everything, oftentimes they would come in, and pit stops back then were very reminiscent of what they are now, where they were very quick, where all they had to do was just change tires. And what was even cooler was, back then, the teams were not required to wear the fireproof Nomex racing suits and helmets or anything else in the pits. You can go back and look at a pit stop from like the late 80s, early 90s, and in some of the warmer races during the summer, you would actually see, and the mechanics would be out there in shorts and polos or button-up shirts, changing tires during the middle of a race.
Wow.
It was way more casual back then than it is now.
Well, because they could be, right?
Yeah, but when refueling was brought back into the sport, and it became much more a part of the strategy that was used by the teams, but it also presented its own series of problems. We had a couple of very well-documented pit lane fires, especially during the 94 season, the disastrous weekend at Hockenheim, where Johnny Herbert got burned pretty badly during a pit stop because the fuel rig because when they brought refueling back reinstituted into the pit stops, they used a very high pressure refueling system so that way they could refuel the cars in a very short period of time. A mechanic didn't fit one of the fuel filters right in the fueling rig. And so when they went to go pull the refueling hose out of the car, fuel splashed all over the engine cover and immediately ignited. There's just some absolutely phenomenal photos from that particular incident of a mechanic on fire, and completely engulfed in fire. But thankfully at that point, when they brought back refueling, that was when they said they required that the mechanics working in the pit had to wear the fireproof suits and some kind of fireproof protection. Now, at that point, I don't believe that they had to wear helmets at that point. I believe it was a few years later when they instituted the need for the helmets as well. At least they were thinking about the mechanics' safety, by forcing them to wear the fireproof suits. And there were several other incidents of fires in the pit lane over the next few years until refueling was banned again. I want to say it was somewhere around 98, 99. Refueling's banned. It's back to just strictly tire stops. So now let's talk about the actual strategy around tire changes in Formula One today. So as I talked about just a few minutes ago, before Pirelli became the sole tire supplier to Formula One, when Michelin and Bridgestone were the tire suppliers, there was really no rules around the tires. But then when Bridgestone became the sole supplier, the FIA instituted that they had to bring at least, I want to say it was 2 compounds of tires to the races. And the teams had the choice of which tires they wanted to run when, but they were required to run each tire at least once during the race.
Interesting.
And most notably, Michael Schumacher used it at one particular race. I forget which one it was, where he literally did almost the entire race distance on one set of tires and then pulled in with like 3 laps to go to do a tire change just simply so that he could comply with that rule. This was back during the era where before they went back to slick tires, back when they still had to have the 4 grooves cut into both the front and rear tires. So with the tire compounds, and especially once Bridgestone pulled out, Pirelli became the sole supplier, and they started providing 3 compounds per race weekend, a soft, medium, and a hard. And that was selected out of a range of 5 tires from like ultra soft all the way up to really hard, in addition to the intermediate and the wets. With the advent of the new tires being supplied by Pirelli, it became much more important for the teams to utilize strategy based around the tires that were on offer for that weekend. Because with the requirement of they had to run at least 2 of the dry tire compounds during a race. Oftentimes,
what was the rationale behind that? Why did the FIA require that?
The FIA required Pirelli to provide 3 compounds per weekend because they wanted it to be able to take and give more of a choice to the teams and the drivers. So if the team wanted to run a hard tire, didn't have as much grip, but wanted to run it longer, it gave the teams more choice of what they wanted to run.
Gotcha.
They did require them to take and do at least 2 of the 3 tire compounds during the race. Basically, Pirelli wanted that so that way they could take and use that to evaluate the tires. And they could compare, okay, this is how the soft compound wore as compared to the medium compound. At this temperature, this particular formulation that was used for the tires saw a lot more graining, as an example, over the course of 10 miles or 15 miles, whereas the medium tire at the same temperature over a much longer stint saw much less degradation in its performance. So I think that's what a lot of it had to do. It was Pirelli working with the FIA to say, because Pirelli, they're not just out there providing tires just for the sake of providing tires.
Right.
We talked about a few weeks ago when we focused more on the tires, when you had multiple companies providing tires. A lot of people think of Formula One racing or sports car racing, IndyCar, any of that. The guys are out there to race just to race. These guys are just out there to go as fast as they can. Yeah. And the teams are out there to take and support them and win the races. You win races, you win money. That's always been the way the teams and the drivers approach racing. But the manufacturers, on the other hand, racing for them is, number one, a gigantic laboratory. That's why stuff that you see on a Formula One car now, all of that is stuff that will eventually trickle down into your road car that you see, that you drive every day to work, that you drive to the shops. Almost every bit of most modern day technologies all stem back to things that were done in racing. So racing is just one, for the manufacturers, is one giant laboratory. And it's also a marketing tool. It's those two things. It's one, it's a laboratory. Two, it's a marketing tool. There's an old saying that win on Sunday, sell on Monday. It was something that is very true, especially here in stateside series like NASCAR and IndyCar, that, oh, hey, I'm looking at buying a new car. Oh, I'm really into IndyCar. Hey, that Honda engine won that IndyCar race on Sunday, so I think I'll go buy me a Honda on Monday. They actually have numbers that it is very much true that win on Sunday, sell on Monday. And it's the same thing with, the tire manufacturers and everything else, because people say, okay, Pirelli's providing the tires for Formula One, so therefore I want to have that same kind of performance in my car, so I'm going to go buy a Pirelli tire. And it's all of that technology and everything that they learn at the racetrack eventually goes back into their road tires, and it eventually trickles down. That's part of the reason why Pirelli wants the teams to use more than one compound on a given race weekend, is because then that way they can do a contrast and compare and see which formulations are working in which tires under which conditions. And so that way they can take and they can build the best road tires that they can to sell to customers. The reason why the strategy is so important is Pirelli will, at the beginning of the weekend, will come out with a suggestion of having seen what the tires can do. They'll run simulations and stuff, and then they'll come back and they hand a set of parameters to the teams that says, okay, we think that the tires perform in such a way that you can start on the medium compound, you can run so many laps, and then you can run the hard tire so many laps, maybe until the end. Or you can start on the hard tire, go longer into the stint, and you'll hit what they call the crossover point, which is the point where the hard tire and the medium tire will degrade down to the point where it's providing the same amount of grip as the hard tire does. And when they hit that crossover point, that's when things can get really exciting during a race. Like I was saying, they give them this is what we think is the optimum tire strategy. Here's what we think is the second best option. Here's what we think is the third best option. And then the teams themselves will actually take and look at that, and then they'll run it through their own simulation. And the teams actually have software that the strategist will literally input all these parameters for a given race weekend. So if they show up in Singapore and they say, okay, forecast says race weekend is going to be hot, 35 degrees centigrade, 97, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be super humid. They put in all those parameters, plus all the parameters from the car, plus all the parameters that Pirelli gives them for the tires. And they will literally run thousands of simulations to say, okay, this is the best tire to start on. This is the best tire to finish with. This is the window of when we want to think about coming in. Right after running these thousands of simulations, that's when they'll come up with their strategy. And at the beginning of the race, they'll have plan A, plan B, plan C. As we all know, during the first couple laps of a race, everything can go out the window. And the next thing you know,
even before the first corner.
Yes, exactly. Somebody gets punted in the back and in the first corner, goes off into the gravel trap. They might be able to continue on, but now they're at the back of the pack and everything that they had planned goes completely out the window.
Right.
And that's the reason why they'll have plan C, plan D, and sometimes they'll say, okay, we're going to go with plan B now, or they'll have a plan C or plan D might be for if that happens, because, okay, well, we didn't have a great qualifying session, so we're starting more towards the back of the grid. So the chances of this happening are much greater. So this is our plan A, but more than likely plan B is going to have to be put into effect, because the chances of us having some kind of accident or getting pushed off the track or something like that is much higher because of our qualifying position.
Right.
So all of these things go into the strategy. And that's the reason why it's like over the last few years, the strategist has become just as important as the aerodynamicist, the technical director, the chief mechanic who manages all the other mechanics and things like that. That's the reason why the strategists have become just as important as any of those other high level members of the team, because they're the ones who take and figure out things like, okay, so this is our pit window, but okay, so one of the things that you'll hear a lot about during races, you'll hear people talk, you'll hear the commentators talk about the undercut and the overcut.
Yep. We saw an example of undercut in the race when Max undercut his own teammate, Checo.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And when you hear them talk about the undercut and the overcut, what they're doing is the strategist is looking at the driver's position on the track. Where's he at in traffic? Is he stuck at the back or in the middle of a 4 or 5 car DRS train, where the one car in the front and you've got 4 cars who all have DRS behind him? The car that's running second in that train can't quite get around him, so therefore they're stacking up the 3rd, 4th, 5th, sometimes 6th car in that DRS train. Well, the team will say, okay, well, if we pull in the driver on lap 31, because of their position on the track, if we do a pit stop, then we might be able to take and get them out in front of the DRS train if we can do a fast enough pit stop. Now, a lot of times that's what's referred to as the undercut. So it's you pit early before your competitor can, so that way you can take and you can pass them in the pits, if you will. And the overcut works exactly the opposite. Sometimes things happen. Either the strategist will miscalculate something, or there might be an issue with the pit stop itself. It takes longer than what was expected, where the leading driver will come in because of that miscalculation or because of the bad pit stop, will actually end up coming out in traffic. And then the driver that was behind him will come into the pit and come out and actually be able to take and get out in front of them simply by the driver that was leading them, that was ahead of them before, is now stuck in traffic. He might be stuck in a DRS train or something like that because of a bad pit stop or a bad calculation. So that's kind of what the overcut works out to, is when you're able to pass the driver because of a miscalculation. So a prime example would be, I'm just throwing out names here. So say you have Alonso's leading, Verstappen's in second, which I know never happens, but this gives you a good idea of the way the overcut would work. Alonso is leading by 13 seconds because of whatever happened. Something happened. Maybe Max got caught and had a bad start, got caught in traffic or something. So, but Max is still running second, but he's 13, 14 seconds behind. The team says, okay, on lap 30, Alonso, we're going to box you. Alonso comes in, has his pit stop. Wheel nut doesn't come off. And instead of taking 2.5 seconds, the pit stop takes 7 seconds. Now, all of a sudden, he comes out and Max is either right on his tail or just past him. At that point, Max can take and pound out a couple of laps, what they refer to as the in laps. He pounds out going just as fast as he can to build that gap to Alonso. And then he's able to come into the pits, and hopefully they have a great pit stop. They get him in and out in 2.2 seconds. And now he comes out right in front of Alonso, and he's able to maintain that position. So that's kind of how the overcut works. The teams have to be willing to say, okay, well, we were originally planning on bringing you in on lap 30, but the guy in front of you pitted early. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go on a longer stint, so that we can build that gap between you and the guy behind you. Hopefully, with him being on fresh tires and everything, he's not going to take and be able to eat back into that gap. And then that way we can bring you in, box you, change out the tires, and get you back out. And you can either come out just either hopefully ahead of him, right on level, or just right behind him. And with the fresh tires being just right behind them, you can overtake them during the lap. So that's how a lot of the times when you hear the overcut and the undercut talked about, that's where that's what they're talking about, is managing, traffic and track position and things like that in order to utilize that to their advantage, to be able to take and pass somebody in the pits that they might not be able to pass on the track. I hope that we haven't completely put everybody to sleep who's listening at the moment.
Thanks, Scott, for all that information on strategy, undercut, overcut, tires, when to use them, when not to, when to change. Strategy is one of the key aspects that really keeps me coming back to F1. I love the strategy behind it. I love seeing how different techniques, different strategies play into the overall wins, or conversely, the overall losses, albeit just like Ferrari, maybe. So thanks for that. And let's go ahead and start talking about the weekend. So let's do a recap.
Sure. So, well, I know on our show notes and everything, we have, I think we're going to skip over I think we're going to flip flop the first two items. So the first thing we have to talk about for the weekend is the weather. As we saw, this weekend was absolutely bonkers when it came to the weather. Like, we saw a very wet start to qualifying, and then the track dried out. It rained right before the start of qualifying, and then we saw the track dry out. And then we saw a dry start to the race on Sunday, and before they even finished the first lap, the skies opened up.
This was an exercise in how good is your mechanic?
Yes. And how good is your strategy, like we were just talking about?
Exactly.
Every single one of the teams, in addition to all the other telemetry that they have on the pit wall for the cars and the team and everything else, they also have weather radar out there, and they are all plugged into different weather radars so that they're all have an idea of when the rain is coming and approximately how long that they think it's going to last. Even with that information in hand, I don't think anybody expected it to start pouring before the first lap was even completed.
What was shocking to me, though, is how long drivers went on the slicks. Not all of them came in immediately. Some of them stayed out for a very long time. It really surprised me, especially the amount of rain that was dumping down on the track.
And then you had Perez, who immediately pulled in, has intermediates put on, and he's out there pounding around, in some cases 7-8 seconds faster than everybody else on the track. All of the drivers who had the foresight to pull, well, with the exception of Ferrari, all the drivers who had the foresight to pull into the pit and grab intermediates right away. We saw Perez out there passing everybody because he's putting down some blistering lap times comparatively, because everybody that stayed out on the slicks were losing so much time. A slick tire in rain on a wet track, it's like driving on ice. There's like zero grip, none whatsoever. And so these drivers are having to try to find grip wherever they can on these slick tires, while the guys who are driving around on the intermediates are eating up huge chunks of time on the guys in front of them, just simply because they're able to garner so much more grip.
It's shocking,
because a lot of people
right?
don't. Yeah. Part of it is that a lot of people don't know this, but they did point it out during the Sky. It was kind of a throwaway comment, though, so I don't know if a lot of people picked up on it and everything, but actually the intermediate and the full wet tires are actually a softer rubber compound than even the ultra soft slicks. But
I didn't realize that. I didn't hear that comment, at least.
Yes. But because they're designed to run in wet conditions, the water cools the tires off and keeps them from just completely disintegrating. That's the reason why you'll see here, when the track starts to dry out, the strategists on the teams have to figure out, they'll talk about the crossover point, where the performance of the full wet or intermediate tire starts to drop off in the drying conditions because it's starting to get hotter. It can't cool itself off. And so therefore it starts to degrade that much faster. That's the reason why a lot of times on a drying track, if it's drying out faster than what they think it is, and they're like halfway through the lap, you'll see drivers driving offline to go through the water just so that they can cool the tires off, because it is so much a softer compound. It's that the combination of the soft compound, and then plus with the way that the grooves are strategically cut into the tire, they're literally pumping away gallons and gallons of water per second. Your average road car, like a high performance summer tire on a road car, will pump probably between 2.5 to 3 gallons of water per second. I heard the number on the telecast. It was somewhere in the range of like 10 to 15 gallons per second that these tires are running. It's very evident when they're running, because the spray that is coming off of the tires into the air as the cars are running down the straights and stuff, it's all that water just being pushed through those grooves, out of those tires, and into the ether. So it became a really, really interesting race. So, all right, so let's talk real quick. Qualifying. Danny Rick, got a feel for the guy. It's only his third race back. It's 2 races before the summer break. Comes back from the summer break. Watching the replay, the accident didn't even look like it was that violent. It was so shocking that what really looked like a very innocuous accident, and he ends up breaking his hand, ends up leaving the track, flying to Spain, and actually has surgery on his hand on Sunday instead of being at the race. That was crazy.
He gets one free practice in, and then he's done.
Yeah, absolutely. And all he was trying to do is, just because the line that he was trying to take through the corner, He had to check up because Oscar Piastri had gone into, had lost control, gone into the barrier. And in order not to T-bone him, he has to check up and winds up just barely, into the barrier. And not only is his day done, but probably a good chunk of the rest of the season for him is done now.
Yeah.
So you really have to kind of feel for the guy.
Yeah, it's just horrible. So happy that he got a seat again, and then this happens. He's out for
absolutely.
At least 2 races, right?
Yeah, at least 2 or 3 races. All right, so New Zealander Liam Lawson, he gets pressed into service. He had the distinction of having a very, very cool record that unfortunately got broken this weekend. Lawson has won his first time out in the last 8 racing categories that he's ever raced in.
Wow.
So that's Formula 2, Formula 3, dating all the way back to, I believe it was Formula Ford or Formula Renault. Every time he has stepped into a brand new category, he has won his first race out.
That's awesome. I didn't realize that.
That's just an insane.
Yeah, it really is.
First time out in a race, he gets pressed into service on Saturday, has to qualify on Saturday with very little seat time in a car that was set up for Ricardo. Doesn't have a great qualifying, ends up qualifying last. All in all, for having qualified last, having so little seat time, you got to give him a lot of credit because he brought the car home in 13th and he finished 2 places ahead of Yuki. So, of his teammate. That's nuts. I think this Lawson kid, I didn't know a lot about him before this weekend, but I think he's definitely somebody we got to keep an eye out for.
I agree. Somebody's going to sweep him up pretty quick, I would imagine. What do you think about Yuki? Looking at Danny Rick, he comes in and the very first race, he beats him. The second race, he beats him. Oh, no, he loses, but not by very much. And then this new guy comes in and day 1, he beats him out of the gate. So I know eyes have been on Yuki. I think Yuki actually had a pretty good race this time, but what are your feelings about that?
Yuki you're right. I mean, Yuki qualified much, much better than Lawson did, but Yuki had some incidents and stuff during the race, a lot of them no fault of his own. So for Yuki to come home in 15th for everything that happened to him during the race, I think one point when he was being passed by, I think it was either Russell or Hamilton, I think it was one of the Mercedes, his front wing gets clipped. So he has to come in and get that fixed. For all things considered, I think Yuki had a pretty good weekend. A lot of people would say, 15th isn't that great. And it was like, considering everything that happened to him this weekend, yeah, that's pretty good, because he could have very easily have wound up in the tire barriers a couple times and through no fault of his own, either because of the weather or through, other drivers and stuff. So no, I think Yuki had a very respectable showing this weekend.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yep. So real quick, let's talk about McLaren. We were hoping that we weren't going to see sudden resurgence of McLaren's form was not going to be lost over the summer break, and they did not disappoint. Lando, I believe it was FP2. He led FP2, ahead of Verstappen. Qualified second, was actually on provisional pole for a couple of minutes before Max came in and pipped him at the end. But they had a really good weekend. Oscar qualified, I think it was either 5th or 6th, comes home, had a very respectable showing himself this weekend, despite his wreck in FP2. Piastri just continues to, I know we kind of badmouthed him early in the season and everything, but this kid is just impressing me more and more with every single weekend, not just with his ability to pedal the car really fast, but just his resiliency as well. After all the hype and all the crap and everything from the silly season to the off season to the early part of the season where he was basically a rolling speed bump, this kid is impressing me more and more with every single weekend. And part of that you have to chalk up to the fact that the McLaren has become so much better a car. He always had the ability, but now McLaren has given him a car that is able to really showcase both he and Lando's talent and abilities. And I really think if there's any team that has a chance of really being able to challenge the Red Bulldozer right now, I think it's McLaren.
And what do you think about Sargent?
I think the Sargent took and did a lot for his own cause this weekend. Well, yes and no. The fact that he actually on merit was actually able to into Q3 for the first time ever, it was very inspired. He was fast all weekend. The only real blight on it is the fact that on his cool down lap, gets himself into Q3, and then on his cool down lap, he puts it into the gravel trap.
You can just see the pain in his you couldn't even see his face, but just his body language. You could just see the pain in that, because he was doing so well, and then his race was dead.
I think that because of his qualifying and practice form from this weekend, I think he bought himself some extra time. But I think the big thing is when we move on to Monza this coming weekend, he's going to have to show a lot of form again this weekend in order to save his seat.
Yeah.
He's going to have, because surprisingly enough, the Williams cars have been much better on low downforce circuits, and they have really struggled on the higher downforce circuits. Zandvoort is a high downforce circuit. So coming into this weekend, the Williams were not really expected to do as well as they did. Albon qualifying, fifth, sixth, somewhere in there. Sargent getting into Q3. This was not something that was expected. So I think that maybe Williams found something over the summer break that helped the high downforce circuits. But now we're going to Monza, which is a low downforce circuit, which is someplace that Williams are expected to excel. So with that being said, I think that Sargent was really going to have to step up his game, take maximum advantage of the Williams being better on a high-speed, low-downforce circuit like Monza. And if he can get himself into Q3 and then keep his nose clean, make it all the way through qualifying, and make it all the way through the race and not crash out first 3 or 4 laps.
Yeah.
This was another case where his crash on Saturday was kind of his fault, because he was a 1/4 of an inch off into the wet on slick tires.
Yeah, right.
It was just, he was off by that much off the dry line, and just the whole back end snapped around on him. And it was the same thing in the rain on slick tires during the race. He goes into the wall. His day is done. I think that if we have good conditions this weekend and he's able to take maximum advantage of the Williams on a low downforce circuit, he could probably do a lot to redeem himself. Him getting into Q3, I think, also really boosted his confidence as well.
Agreed.
So, I think that that's what he needed. He needed that confidence boost in order to start taking advantage. When the car's right, he can take advantage of it, because Albon's been able to do that. When the car's right, Albon has taken maximum advantage of it. And I think that if Sargent can start doing the same thing, I think he's got at least a chance at, at least keeping the seat for a little while longer. So let's talk real quick about Mercedes Jekyll and Hyde performance this weekend. So once again, both cars super strong in free practice. We get to qualifying, and it's a tale of 2 totally different cars. You've got Russell qualifies a brilliant 3rd, and you got Hamilton doesn't even make it out of Q2.
I know.
So it's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
And then they both had a somewhat middling race. Russell, he ends up being classified, but he ends up crashing out at the end and screwing up the car. Hamilton had an inspired drive to come home in 6th place despite everything else. So it's like really weird times at Mercedes. More woes for Ferrari. Disastrous pit stops. They come in to get the intermediates put on. They don't even have the freaking tires ready. They're running out of the garage with tires, and just absolutely nuts. Let's not kick the dead horse while it's down. Let's just hope that they have a better showing this coming weekend at Monza for the Tifosi. Moving on.
Wholeheartedly agree. Yes.
So Aston Martin has a really great rebound weekend. Hadn't done very well since Montreal, and they came back. Alonso has a very good qualifying. He's back on the podium with a brilliant 2nd place. After the events during the race, they play the strategy perfectly to get him into 2nd place. And at one point, he's hunting down Max. Really, really great weekend for them. And he had absolutely the pass of the day, if not the pass of the year during the start of the race, when he takes and goes low through turn 3 and jumps. I think it was either 2 or 3 cars, just absolutely once again to show that Alonso is like Tom Brady and these other sports stars who are late in their careers, who are still executing it at a high level. It just shows that once again, Alonso is on another level, even at, at 41 years old.
Right. Exactly. It was so good to see him up there again. It's so good to see Alonso doing well. His last race or two just was not that good.
All right. So last thing before we wrap up, Max Verstappen wins his 9th consecutive race. So that puts him in really rarefied air. That puts him on par with Sebastian Vettel and Alberto Ascari. And even with the Ascaris, you have to put an asterisk by it. If you're not familiar with Alberto Ascari's record, is he won 9 races that he entered. And that was starting at the end of 50, I believe it was the 52 season. and into 53. But in 53, the Indianapolis 500 was a points paying race for the drivers' championship. And Ascari did not enter the race. So he didn't actually start that race. The 9 races he started in a row, he won the gap in there. So some people believe that he only won 7 in a row because he didn't win, never entered that 8th race, but in that string. So I'm of the opinion, though, that because the Indy 500 is not a true Grand Prix, even though it was a points paying race, I think it's wrong to discount what Ascari did just simply because he chose not to enter that race. But getting back to Verstappen, so this puts him in very rarefied air. I think we're witnessing, probably maybe the most dominant driver, since Sebastian Vettel.
And people are starting to hate him as much as they did Vettel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so easy to want to hate on him just simply because he is so good.
Yeah, but he's still humble. He's not one of these that, I'm the best driver ever or anything like that. He's still very humble.
It's hard to not like the guy. And it's and also because he's a very clean racer. He's not out there. He's not like Schumacher. Schumacher, for all of his talent, I never really particularly cared for Schumacher simply because he would rather crash into you and take both you and he out of the race than let you pass him. And he did it on a number of occasions. It's one of those things that Schumacher was more of a dirty driver, whereas Verstappen's a clean driver. He's not out there taking people out. All in all, I think it's fantastic. I also think it's great for the sport. I think it shows just how healthy the sport is. The fact that we've got a driver who has been able to come along. And as we've talked about on a number of occasions, that yes, he does have the best car available, but he's taking full advantage of it because Perez has access to the same car and he's had his stumbles this year. And Verstappen hasn't had any of those stumbles. He has taken maximum advantage of the situation.
Every single time.
Kudos on him.
Absolutely right.
All right. So I think we should go ahead and wrap it up here. So we're going to come back to you in a week's time. We're going to be talking about the Italian Grand Prix. We're back at the high-speed Autodrome Monza, one of the fastest circuits on the calendar. It's going to shape up for a fantastic race. We'll go ahead and call it a day. And for Corey Brune, I'm Scott Vick, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to F1 Great Chat. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher. Also, help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. We value your feedback and passion, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Brune, until next time, stay inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.